When it comes to animatronic dining experiences, the selection is few and far between, and their popularity seems to be fading away more and more as time goes on. But this wasn't always the case, and for several decades they were one of the biggest fads in restaurant and live entertainment history. Without a doubt, the two most iconic that led to this phenomenon was Chuck E. Cheese Pizza Time Theater and Showbiz Pizza Place. But there's more to both restaurants than meets the eye, and the story behind each franchise is full of unexpected origins, drama, betrayal, and a lot of unintentionally horrific animatronics. So let's go back to a much simpler and stranger time with the rise and fall of Showbiz Pizza Place and Chuck E. Cheese Pizza Time Theater. The story begins in a very unlikely time and place in history, with a college freshman by the name of Nolan Bushnell at the University of Utah in the 1960s. You see, Bushnell was pursuing a degree in electrical engineering, and like most universities in the 60s, the college's computer department had a computer game called Space War. It was quite literally the world's first video game, and he found himself absolutely captivated by this innovative piece of technology. But it's at a local amusement park where things really began to take shape, as to put himself through college, in the summers he worked as a ride operator. He eventually worked his way up to manager of the games department, where he oversaw the Midway arcade games. Now it may seem like a strange analogy, but much like the delicious combination of chocolate and peanut butter that led to the Reese's Peanut Butter Cup, it was the amalgamation of these theme park arcade games and the college's Space War computer game that led to his brilliant idea: video game arcades. He then set forth on making this vision a reality, in which he eventually co-founded the entertainment company Syzygy to produce the first arcade video game in history, Computer Space. Unfortunately, this didn't take the world by storm as he anticipated, more than likely due to the game's complexity and steep learning curve. So he changed the name of his company to Atari, and in 1972 debuted Pong, but this time the results were a bit more optimistic.
Home video games have been a success from the moment a company called Atari launched this basic game, Pong. They're selling like crazy. 300,000 last year. This year, 3 million.
The massive success of Pong was the spark that ignited the video game arcade fire, and quickly became one of the fastest growing industries in the country. But despite seeing an avalanche of profits from Pong and the games that followed, Bushnell soon realized the real money wasn't in selling the machines, it was securing locations to operate them. The problem was he wanted to avoid competing with the arcades, not to mention the owners he was selling his systems to. So he came up with the idea of a video game arcade using food as a support structure. This would allow him to avoid direct and undesirable competition, and potentially build a brand new franchise of his own. Now, much like the chocolate peanut butter analogy, there were a number of separate inspirations that, when put together, proved to be the perfect combination for this arcade restaurant hybrid. First was realizing that pizza was by far the easiest type of food to, as he put it, not screw up, so Pizza Parlor seemed like the perfect venue. Then, upon visiting a pizza and organ pipes restaurant, which, as strange as it sounds, was a huge fad in the 60s and 70s, he saw there was a demand for live entertainment to go along with the pizza. Another source of inspiration came from a trip to Disneyland with his daughters, where by sheer coincidence, he had applied for a job as an Imagineer straight out of college. But since the company rarely hired recent college graduates, he was repeatedly turned down for the position. Anyway, he was especially impressed with Walt Disney's Enchanted Tiki Room, which also by sheer coincidence was initially going to be an animatronic dinner show. The way he saw it, animatronics would be a fantastic way to entertain patrons as they dined, and he just so happened to have the engineers at his fingertips to figure out a way to go about doing it. The final piece of the pizza puzzle was Country Bear Jamboree, as apparently he was influenced by its wry humor, catchy musical numbers, and wide cast of lovable characters. Even better was how the show appealed to both children and parents. But the Disney theme park inspirations didn't end there, as Bushnell also envisioned the Pizza Parlor arcade with an iconic mascot in the same vein as Mickey Mouse.
Can we count on you?
You can count on me.
Can we count on you?
You can count on me.
Now, despite popular belief, the original intention wasn't to also be a mouse, but a coyote, and the title of the restaurant was going to be Coyote Pizza. Bushnell even purchased what he thought was a coyote costume from an IAAPA trade show, or International Association of Amusement Parks and Attractions. However, once the costume was sent back to Atari, they realized it was actually a rat. So it seems he decided to embrace the obvious similarities to Mickey Mouse, as the character was then given the name of Rick Rat, or Ricky Rat, with the title of the restaurant also changed to Ricky Rat's Pizza Time Theater. But Atari's PR agency felt having the word rad in the title of a restaurant probably wasn't the best idea. So the mascot and restaurant was given a new title, the Big Cheese's Pizza Time Theater. Unfortunately, the Marriott hotel chain, for whatever reason, already had a trademark on the name The Big Cheese. So the creative team put their heads together and came up with the name Chuck E. Cheese for the mascot, and the restaurant became Chuck E. Cheese's Pizza Time Theater. But the cigar-smoking rat would also be joined by a handful of other characters, and together they would be known as the Pizza Time Players.
Now, if you're a parent and you've got some kids at home, I think you better pay attention to this story, because before too long, Chuck E. Cheese and his Pizza Time Theater will be a very intimate feature in your life.
On May 17, 1977, the very first Chuck E. Cheese's Pizza Time Theater made its debut in San Jose, California. And while the food itself was criticized as somewhat mediocre, its Atari-centric video game arcade proved to be just as big of a draw as Bushnell had predicted. Top that off with the unique entertainment offerings by way of animatronic performers, and the restaurant was a huge hit with families. So it should come as no surprise that Noah and Bushnell wanted to expand ASAP. But there was just one thing in the way: Warner Communications. You see, just a year prior, Bushnell had sold Atari to Warner Communications for $28 million. In addition to the sale itself, one of his stipulations was that Warner fully fund one Chuck E. Cheese restaurant, which they did, but they simply had no interest in building another. This was a major problem because they legally owned all the intellectual property, such as characters, logos, names, and everything in between. So Bushnell was forced to buy the restaurant and conceptual rights from Warner for $500,000, or just over $2 million today. He then established Pizza Time Theater, Inc., and once again set forth on making his vision a reality.
The company's ultimate aim is to create a cutesy fantasy world in every neighborhood, to bring a mini Disneyland to your doorstep, and of course, to help your children spend a lot more of your money. Dolly Dimples, the singing hippopotamus, is powered by a computer system capable of handling 450 instructions per second. Dolly has a repertoire of more than 20 medleys and a bosom that rises and falls with compressed air.
The second Chuck E. Cheese restaurant opened just a year later, which utilized a former grocery store and was 4 times the size of the first location, making it the largest pizza parlor in the country. New additions included Dolly Dimples the piano-playing hippo, which, quick fun fact, was intended to be for adults due to her somewhat risque dialogue and, bouncing bosom. To deter kids from entering, they even made a sign with the words "especially for mom and dad." However, ultimately it was never posted, and she often entertained children of all ages. The game room was also expanded to become the Fantasy Forest Game Preserve, featuring virtually every popular arcade video game on the market. There were also a number of changes to the Pizza Time Players, adding both new characters and altering the appearance of others.
The Pizza Time Theater proudly presents
Down by the old
not the new but the old
stream.
not the river but the stream.
The second location also proved to be a major hit with families, and gave Bushnell the confidence to leave Atari and focus solely on his Pizza Time Theater restaurants. He would do this with the help of eager franchisees, and he soon began to add even more locations all over the country. By the end of the next year, there were almost 10 additional Chuck E. Cheese restaurants, and was on track to open 300 more by 1984, and 1,000 by the end of the decade. A major player of this massive expansion was to be Robert Brock, or Bob Brock, the president of Topeka Inn Management. You see, in the years prior, he had already amassed quite the fortune by franchising Holiday Inn locations all over the world, and was drawn to the prospect of getting a slice of the Pizza Time Theater profits. Don't worry, I'll keep the pizza puns to a bare minimum. So in 1979, Bob Brock signed a $200 million co-development contract with Noah and Bushnell, and became an official partner of Pizza Time Theaters, Inc. To keep it simple, this gave him exclusive rights to franchise his own Chuck E. Cheese locations in 16 states all across the country. But as a way to supervise these restaurants, Brock formed a subdivision of Pizza Time Theaters within his own company, Pizza Showbiz. However, this unintentionally set the stage for turning what began as the beginning of a beautiful partnership into a bitter pizza parlor rivalry for the ages.
Aaron had the idea to use animated characters for advertising purposes, and Willie is the first to do so, and with no limit to his vocabulary.
He's got a computer inside. The computer selects from various numbers of messages which he is capable of producing. So it's pretty random. You never know what he's going to say next.
Enter the founder of creative engineering, Aaron Fechter, a young inventor who specialized in mechanical figures. You see, beginning in 1977, he began showcasing his animatronics at the Association of Amusement Parks and Attractions, the same trade show mentioned earlier. First were a number of standalone figures, such as Willy the Rabbit, Friendly Freddy, and Count Dracula. This led to animatronic ensembles, such as the Confederate Critter Show that was sold to Magic World, and the totally not a ripoff of Disney's Country Bear Jamboree, Bear Country Jubilee. Now at one of these early trade shows, he was approached by Nolan Bushnell, the same year he purchased the coyote but not really a coyote costume. As it turns out, Bushnell wanted to purchase Aaron Fechter's animatronics for his in-development pizza parlor, but out of fear of Atari reverse engineering his creations and putting him out of business, he politely declined. At the next year's convention, Aaron Fechter displayed even more elaborate animatronics, this time featuring a band/comedy ensemble known as the Wolfpack 5. The event was once again attended by Nolan Bushnell, who was even more impressed by what he saw, and once again made an offer to the young inventor. However, this time Bushnell wanted to purchase more than just Aaron Fechter's animatronics, as he offered to buy his entire company as well, but Fechter still had no interest in selling. Now, as an important side note, at some point Bushnell had spoken of Aaron Fechter's animatronics to Bob Brock, but allegedly he downplayed their quality as cheap and subpar. So fast forward to 1979, as with Bob Brock's first Chuck E. Cheese restaurant only months away from opening, he flew to Orlando to meet with the young inventor for himself out of curiosity. Brock was then given a tour of creative engineering and was blown away by the quality of Fechter's mechanical figures, expressing his opinion that they were far superior to the Pizza Time Theater animatronics. In fact, he had actually been fairly critical of the ones used by Chuck E. Cheese, and had expressed this to Nolan Bushnell when the two were negotiating. However, while Brock was assured they would dramatically improve going forward, even as his first restaurant was about to open, this had yet to happen and was growing concerned. So ultimately, Bob Brock decided Aaron Fechter's animatronics were the future of pizza parlor stage show dining, and the two set forth to create their own franchise, Showbiz Pizza Place.
I bet that pizza tastes good.
You've never seen a place like Showbiz Pizza Place. We'll serve you a pizza second to none. So come for pizza, stay for the fun.
The very first Showbiz Pizza Place opened its doors in Kansas City in March of 1980, and was actually the location that was supposed to be his first Chuck E. Cheese restaurant. However, at the last minute, he decided to make it the pilot store for his new venture, which is why it featured some rather suspicious-looking Chuck E. Cheese-related set decorations. But the spur-of-the-moment decision also unintentionally led to the restaurant's iconic characters and mascot. You see, while the plan was to create a host of brand new characters for Showbiz Pizza Place, the decision to utilize his Chuck E. Cheese location meant time was of the essence. So for the first location, Bob Brock chose to just go with whatever Aaron Fechter's company already had on hand, which as fate would have it was the Wolfpack 5. But to make it at least somewhat unique, they made a few minor alterations to the show tapes and character designs. However, these short-term animatronic characters wound up being very popular, so the group would stay on as the foundation for future locations. This was the same case for the restaurant's mascot Billy Bob, as he was just a slightly redesigned character from the totally not a knockoff of Country Bear Jamboree, Bear Country Jubilee. Although it is worth mentioning that initially he was only a walk-around character, and not actually part of the stage show. The second Showbiz Pizza Place opened for business in August of 1980, and this was the one that solidified the restaurant into American pop culture with the Rock-afire explosion. The show now officially featured Billy Bob and his pal Looney Bird, Mitzi Mozzarella, Duke LaRue and Fats Geronimo, Beach Bear, along with Rolf de Rolf and Earl Schmurl.
We've got singing fun at Showbiz, eating fun at Showbiz, electronic fun at Showbiz, Showbiz Pizza Place. We've got big kids fun at Showbiz, little kids fun at Showbiz, family fun at Showbiz, Showbiz Pizza Place. Share the fun, come on and share the fun at Showbiz Pizza Place.
Now at this point you're probably wondering, okay, so what happened to Bob Brock and Nolan Bushnell's massive Chuck E. Cheese expansion deal? Well, shortly after meeting Aaron Fechter, Nolan Bushnell received a call from Bob Brock who demanded to be let out of his contract. When Bushnell refused, Brock decided to go ahead and start up Showbiz Pizza anyway. This led to a lawsuit from Chuck E. Cheese on the grounds of breach of contract and theft of trade secrets. Showbiz Pizza then filed a countersuit on the grounds of misrepresentation, claiming they were misled into believing that outside of the Disney parks, Chuck E. Cheese had the only suitable animatronic system. And thus the pizza parlor battle officially began, with both franchises constantly trying to one-up the other. In some cases, Pizza Time Theater and Showbiz Pizza purposely built new locations right next door to each other, forcing families to side with either Chuck E. Cheese and the Pizza Time players or Billy Bob and the Rock-afire explosion.
The elements here at Showbiz Pizza are very similar to Pizza Time. Video games, kiddie rides, mechanical stage shows, and pizza. The big difference is in the sophistication of the animated figures. The movements are more lifelike and the songs aimed at a more adult audience. I really enjoyed the musical arrangements of Showbiz Pizza's Rock-afire explosion and was captivated by the choreography. This is a slick performance by any standard.
While the lawsuit resumed in the background, additional Showbiz Pizza restaurants began popping up all over the country, and the production of animatronic Rock-afire shows also began to skyrocket. The technology behind the mechanical figures was also improved, which led to an average cost of $100,000 per restaurant, or just over $300,000 today. Confident of their future, Showbiz Pizza was also spending quite a bit of money on R&D, with the majority of funds going towards even more advanced second-generation animatronics. One of these was Uncle Clunk, who is capable of 32 different movements and was to be a major addition to the stage shows. There was also a far more advanced Mitzi Mozzarella in the works, as well as a second-generation Duke, who would have played the drums with far more realism, with the ultimate goal to update all of the characters by the 1990s. However, at the same time as Showbiz Pizza, their competition was also going through quite a few changes of their own.
Smile America, say Chuck E. Cheese. Smile America, say Chuck E. Cheese. Food and games and all kinds of creatures. Oh, taste the Pizza Time Theater. Smile America, say Chuck E. Cheese.
Much like Showbiz, new locations were popping up all across the US, and along with the addition of new attractions and video games, major updates were also made to the animatronics and stage shows. For starters, the original portrait-style presentation was completely abandoned and replaced with a far more impressive balcony variation. These newer animatronics were known as Cyberamics, and were meant to give the ones over at Showbiz Pizza a true run for their money. These more complex animated figures performed on balconies and featured a new set of comedy routines and song covers, although the basic concept was still the same. Many locations also saw the addition of new characters for the cabaret room, such as Artie Antlers, who was originally called Elkton John, and BB Bubbles. But don't worry, Dolly Dimples and her bouncing bosom was left in a handful of the restaurants, which no doubt led to some poor child to grow up with a strange and unexplainable hippo fetish. There were also new pun-centric sideshows such as the Beagles, who performed songs by the Beatles, and the Beach Bowsers, who played songs by the Beach Boys. Yet another addition was the King, a 9-foot-tall animatronic lion who sang Elvis Presley covers. In a select few locations, there was even a Michael Jackson variation, and at one point was known as Michael Katzen. Finally, I'd be remiss if I didn't briefly mention Cheesy Street, otherwise known as the Cheese Factory. It had a Disneyland-inspired facade, and inside was basically a funhouse. However, this was a bit of an unintentional nightmare for kids, as many wound up getting lost in the maze, which led to an urban legend of disappearing children. Another unintentionally horrific adventure was Mr. Munch's Magic Madhouse, which could be found quite literally under the balcony stage. Inside was also a maze, but supposedly contained panic-inducing strobe lighting, and was eventually closed due to, quote, poor conditions inside the tunnels. Now, if all these new additions seem a bit all over the place, you're not crazy, as this was done to make each restaurant unique, which also enticed patrons to visit different locations within the same city or state. So yeah, both Chuck E. Cheese and Showbiz Pizza saw tremendous growth in the early 80s, and both expected to have over 1,000 locations before the end of the decade. But while the battle of the animatronic-centric pizza parlors was mainly between these two monolithic franchises, their rising popularity led to a slew of copycat locations.
Dining out is one of the fastest growing leisure activities of the 1980s, and I think we're getting a more and more sophisticated audience that expects good food, but they want to be entertained. And we want to entertain them and give them a place that's fun to come to, where they can spend the entire evening.
Just to name a few examples, there was Bullwinkle's Family Food and Fun, PJ Pizzazz's Family Fun, John Philip Tuba's, Sergeant Singer's Pizza Circus, and Gadget's Restaurant, featuring Sammy Sands and the Looney Tunes stage show. But wait, I'm not done. There was also the Magic Pizza, Fuzzy Wuzzy Wizard's Wonderland of Food and Fantasy, Razzmatazz Pizza Palace, Major Magic's All-Star Pizza Review, Fairplay Pizza Theater, Tex Critter's Pizza Jamboree, The Pizza Planet next to Denim World, Gigglebee's Robots Pizza and Games, Mark Twain's Riverboat Playhouse, Captain Andy's River Town, Captain's Carnival, Circus Playhouse Restaurant, Circus World Pizza Restaurant, Grand Prix Pizza Cabaret, Juster's Courtyard Playland, The Enchanted Castle, The Celebration Station, and last but not least, Dimes and Critters Pizza. So yeah, to say it was a fad is a bit of an understatement.
By the way, the entertainment by the Critter Band is free, so come to Dimes and Critters in the 5 Mile Shopping Center for a great value and a great time.
Now it's important to mention that in 1982, the lawsuit between Pizza Time Theater and Showbiz Pizza finally came to a conclusion. Ultimately, the case was settled out of court, in which Showbiz Pizza agreed to pay close to $1 million in damages, as well as a percentage of their profits for the next 14 years. So for a time it seemed Pizza Time Theater came out ahead as the victor, but severe financial trouble was brewing for the company behind the scenes. You see, during Chuck E. Cheese's aggressive expansion, franchisees were allowed to go virtually unchecked with their spending and promotional campaign expenses. Another issue were the labor costs for upkeeping the animatronic shows, as they built up with each new location and were vastly underestimated. But more importantly, the appeal and novelty of these stage show-centric pizza parlors simply began to wear off, and the also aggressively expanding Showbiz Pizza Place only saturated the market even further. To put it simply, the opening of new locations was outpacing the need for new locations, too much supply and not nearly enough demand. These financial troubles were coming to a head in 1983, and they might have recovered if it hadn't also been the same year as the video game market crash. Now it's a bit of an oversimplification of a complex topic, but for our purposes, the oversaturation of video game consoles led to a decline in video game arcade attendance, which was one of Chuck E. Cheese's major selling points. Another detriment was Atari's financial loss of $500 million, which all but destroyed the company, as keep in mind, they were the biggest supplier of video games to Pizza Time Theater. However, the Achilles heel of their downfall was Nolan Bushnell himself, as he'd invested much of the pizza profits into new ventures within the video game and tech industry. So when Chuck E. Cheese began hemorrhaging a combined total of $20 million every month, there was no cash to bail them out. This led to the resignation of founder Nolan Bushnell, and that March, Pizza Time Theater filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. But Showbiz Pizza was also suffering from many, if not all, the same problems as Chuck E. Cheese, as their once exponential growth just a few years earlier had also come to a screeching halt. The decline in business had also abruptly stopped the flow of money into R&D, with the second-generation, more advanced Showbiz animatronics cancelled midway in development. The only one to escape this fate was the terrifying, lovable Uncle Clunk, who actually did wind up debuting in a handful of locations. Unfortunately, this well-intentioned nightmare fuel wasn't all that well received, and this led to a ton of Uncle Clunks going unsold and unused. But Uncle Clunk wasn't the only victim, as Showbiz Pizza's abrupt expansion cancellation led to a massive surplus of Rock-afire animatronics at creative engineering with nowhere to go.
He's the funniest robot science ever made.
Hello, you're on the air with Uncle Clunk. Oh, I get it. You're doing your impression of a telephone ringing. What are you, some kind of nut? I'd say you were more some kind of fruit, actually.
Now, despite the decline of both pizza parlors, due to the lawsuit, Showbiz Pizza was the one still making payouts to Chuck E. Cheese. So in order to save the company, Showbiz Pizza set out to purchase the now bankrupt Chuck E. Cheese and absorb all their assets. The merger led to Showbiz Pizza and Pizza Time Theaters to unify as a single entity, which in 1985 became Showbiz Pizza Time Inc. It's also worth mentioning that, similar to Nolan Bushnell, Bob Brock wound up stepping down from his position as president and CEO of Showbiz Pizza. As far as the restaurants themselves, they were more or less kept independent from each other, except when it came to the marketing, as Billy Bob and Chuck E. Cheese were now seen as pals and part of the same bizarre pizza parlor animal universe. Both franchises were also rebranded with new logos and simplified titles, now sharing the same color scheme and word font. Going even further, all the commercials and TV spots for both restaurants were made to be almost identical and interchangeable.
But at Showbiz Pizza you can act like a kid, you can have more fun than you ever did. But at Chuck E. Cheese you can act like a kid, you can have more fun than you ever did. You can giggle, you can wiggle, you can flip your lid. Chuck E. Cheese, where a kid can be a kid. You can giggle, you can wiggle, you can flip your lid. Showbiz Pizza, where a kid can be a kid.
Now, for a time, it did seem like both pizza parlors would be spared from complete obscurity, but it wasn't long after the merger that Chuck E. Cheese began getting the spotlight over Showbiz Pizza. A major factor behind this favoritism was due to an unforeseen ramification of the acquisition. Showbiz Pizza no longer had exclusive rights to the Rock-afire explosion. This meant Aaron Fechter's company could now license the popular stage show to other businesses. It also meant they could develop and sell variations of the show, with one example being the Moonrockers, which were essentially the same band but with cosmetic and show tape alterations. Showbiz Pizza did continue to keep the Rock-afire explosion units in the restaurants, but they soon began making changes to the presentation to make it a bit more unique to the pizza parlor. One of the most intriguing was the Yogi Bear show, and while footage of it has yet to surface, there's evidence that it was in at least a handful of locations. Another variation was known as the Magic Stage, although precisely which location or locations tested this retheming is unknown. As far as the terrifying Uncle Clunk, he became Orwell, a robot you control, and while certainly educational for budding engineers, this somehow made the animatronic even more horrific. But Showbiz Pizza wasn't alone in major changes, as the merger also affected many aspects of Chuck E. Cheese Pizza Time theater. Alongside Showbiz, the food quality was improved, as well as featuring a new selection of non-video game-based arcade games. As far as changes to the main form of entertainment, a select few locations saw the addition of the incredibly bizarre Family Album stage show. Equally as strange was another variation called the Hot Fudge Show, but evidently these were both placeholders while developing new Chuck E. Cheese animatronics. Soon the majority of locations were unified with a brand new show called Chucky's House, which was basically a more advanced version of the balcony stage show. It also incorporated live performances alongside the animatronics, with the usual assortment of show tunes and popular song covers. The combination of updates and alterations to both pizza parlors led to a moderate sales increase across all locations, and their prospects began to look far more optimistic. But things would soon take a turn for the worse. Or better, depending on which characters and restaurant you were a bigger fan of. You see, as a way to gain back the exclusivity of the Rock-afire explosion, the new owners of Showbiz Pizza were putting major pressure on Aaron Fechter to hand over the copyrights. But after he repeatedly refused, the decision was made to get rid of them entirely in favor of a new show, Mr. Munch's Make-Believe Band.
Next will be Billy Bob. First his overalls, then mask, body fur, hands, left foot and foam ankles, and then his right foot, which will need to be unbolted.
The drastic initiative was known as Concept Unification and spanned across all Showbiz Pizza restaurants, in which the beloved Rock-afire explosion characters were skinned of all their aesthetics down to their bones. Or mechanics. These same animatronic characters were then given new cosmetics and costumes based on the Chuck E. Cheese characters, and though I realize these are simply inanimate objects, there's something incredibly unsettling about this process. So just like that, practically overnight, Mr. Munch's Make-Believe Band was the new face of Showbiz Pizza. And by new face, I mean the disembodied corpses of the Rock-afire explosion. What's really interesting is that thanks to internal documents made public by ShowbizPizza.com, it turns out they initially toyed around with a brand new show featuring a completely new set of characters. And speaking of ShowbizPizza.com, for even more history on these pizza parlors, definitely check out the site once you finish the episode. It's been a truly invaluable source for information, photographs, and archival footage, and the documentation of the two franchises is nothing short of astounding. Anyway, Concept Unification meant Billy Bob and his pals were erased from existence within the restaurants in every possible way, with only the name of the restaurant being left intact. But the final nail in the coffin for Showbiz Pizza came in 1992, as every single location officially became Chuck E. Cheese restaurants, and the name Showbiz Pizza was officially retired.
Why go to a boring restaurant when you can go to Chuck E.'s? Next time Mom says, let's eat out. Remember, Chuck E. Cheese, please. The restaurant where a kid can be a kid.
All through the 90s and early 2000s, Chuck E. Cheese continued to dramatically expand, not to mention evolve with the times. Most of these efforts were done as a way to keep the Big Cheese himself hip, trendy, and cool for a new generation of kids. But as far as the animatronic entertainment, these soon began taking steps backward in quality. You see, when it came time to update the stage shows, initially they began testing an elaborate successor, the Chuck E. Cheese Awesome Adventure Machine. However, this was seen as too costly to operate, so a simplified and scaled back version known as Studio C was installed in the vast majority of locations. But over the years, the robotics were scaled back even further, and the updated figures for Mr. Munch's Make-Believe Band were a true example of this. So it should come as no surprise that in 2017, the process of phasing them out entirely officially began, and continues to this day. By 2019, Chuck E. Cheese was valued at a whopping $1.4 billion, with close to 600 locations. However, the COVID-19 pandemic took a huge toll on the pizza place, and the company was ultimately forced to file for bankruptcy, again, in June of 2020.
This show that you see behind me has been in existence for about 12 years, and even though it's still running really well and gets a lot of good reviews, there's a lot of new technology that's been developed since then. We've had a lot of new ideas since then. So we just wanted to update it and have a new show that would take us into the 21st century.
As far as Chuck E. Cheese's original rival, after concept unification, Aaron Fechter's company never really recovered. Production on new Rock-afire explosion units came to a near screeching halt, leading to hundreds of employees to be let go from the once booming headquarters. But that's not to say it was the end of Fechter's animatronic creations, as he would go on to produce a number of variations to the Rock-afire explosion. Unfortunately, they never seemed to take a hold of the public the same way as the original. One of the final nails in the coffin for creative engineering was the anti-gravity freedom machine, which was basically an email device before there was email. However, right around the time the product was released, the internet boom officially began, and email came with it, without the need for an expensive and specific machine to do it from. So he was ultimately forced to lay off the last remaining of his once 300+ employees.
And then there's email.
Email? I heard that's really neat. My cousin has a pen pal in Sweden and they write back and forth and it transmits right away and doesn't cost anything.
Yeah, you can even talk with people all over the world on chat lines.
Over the years, many attempts have been made to resurrect the Rock-afire explosion, as well as Showbiz Pizza as a standalone location. From restaurants like Rock-afire Pizza, Billy Bob's Wonderland, Showbiz Pizza Zone, Looney Birds, or even the Rock-afire Bar. However, with the exception of Billy Bob's Wonderland, all these locations eventually had to close their doors. As far as the present, Aaron Fechter still works to preserve both creative engineering and his mechanical creations, and for a price you can even tour the now mostly abandoned headquarters. Although he is still working on that second-generation Duke, so who knows what the future holds. Robert Brock, or Bob Brock, passed away of cancer in 1998, while Nolan Bushnell continues to contribute to the ever-changing world of technology. As far as the Rock-afire explosion itself, there's no question that their legacy, and those who are a part of it, continue to live on. The most notable example by far is the Five Nights at Freddy's franchise, which used a combination of the Showbiz Pizza animatronics and Chuck E. Cheese as a clear and obvious source of inspiration. But let's be honest, even without the horror settings of a video game, the animatronics themselves continue to be a source of a ton of unintentional nightmare fuel, at least the ones in various states of disrepair. So at the end of the day, while both of the original Pizza Parlor animatronic spectaculars are a distant memory, enough of what made them so unique still exists today to ensure they'll never be forgotten.